Hello and welcome back to Rev Real Estate School. I'm your host, Michael Montgomery, and today we're joined by Willemina, and we have kind of a fun episode for you today. Today what we're looking at is a listing debrief. And the listing debrief is not based on a listing that we got. It was a listing that we were actually not selected for. And so we thought it'd be a worthwhile exercise because we were actually talking about this. And we're going back and forth on whether this was a pro or whether it was a con. What did we do right? What did we do wrong? And we thought, it might just make sense for us to actually discuss this so we can analyze the pros and the cons and what actually potentially went right and what potentially went wrong in this scenario. So Willemina, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Excited to be back.
Yeah, absolutely. You're always back by popular demand. But we have an interesting scenario here. And just to kind of give everybody some backstory. So Willemina, my wife and business partner, we do work together. And most of the time, the way that we would approach a given listing would be I will oftentimes kind of do the listing presentation almost kind of like client acquisition stage. And then Willemina's doing a lot by way of listing maintenance, but also the detailed work required in order to ensure A, we're going to be priced appropriately and how we're coming to market. So we kind of have these two roles. But this situation is a little bit interesting because we were both part of the listing process. And I will say this in jumping into this, we're changing names and numbers and everything just to be on the safe side. But that being said, there's nothing wrong with how this situation actually played out. So I'll give you a little bit of the lay of the land, and then we're going to jump into how we're thinking through it. So to start with, the individual that selected not to work with us, we'd been in contact with him for, actually known him probably about 5 years or so. Beautiful, beautiful house, and actually a lot of really positives about A, the house, but then also the client. And so ultimately, what we want to get out of this is that we do wish the client well. At the end of the day, we always wish the client well and hope that they have a fantastic experience and hope they find an agent that is actually the right fit for them. Because in this case, we weren't the right fit, which is perfectly fine. So I think it's important that we just lay that groundwork out because just because somebody doesn't select us doesn't mean that they're a bad person and doesn't necessarily mean that their home's not going to sell. It just means that potentially we weren't the right fit. And so we're going to get into some details about that. But to let you kind of know how the scenario played out, this individual has been looking to sell for probably a couple of years now, or thinking about the selling process, and now moving towards the process of putting the home on the market. So the home is quite a unique property and very hard to price. I think we've probably all been there in the real estate industry where it's just very hard to price a given home because they're just not the comparables. And so that's the situation that we were in from a pricing standpoint. And then the challenge of this, of course, is that the seller is going to have a perspective on the price, and then we're going to have a perspective on the price. And a couple of years ago, we started to talk about the listing process. And the seller had a price in mind. And let's say that price was around $950. Our perspective at that point in time was that the home was worth around $700. And that's a really important point to this. Is a couple of years ago when we started this conversation, there was a pretty hefty disconnect between pricing that we had in our minds and pricing that he had. The challenge that we had, though, was without the actual comparables to back it up, it's kind of hard to actually start to convince a seller that a market's not going to pay a given price if you don't have the data to back it up, especially in a market that is seeing a lot of appreciation, like a lot of our markets have seen over the past number of years. So this conversation becomes quite challenging. Anyways, to make a long story short, we did a couple of listing presentations, been over to the house a number of times, and then had kind of the ultimate listing presentation a few weeks ago where we went in and sat down and chatted with them. And they had a number of questions for us. And actually, when we were going into this meeting, we were a little concerned, weren't we? We were a little concerned about whether we wanted to take on the listing. Is that how you felt too?
Yeah, we were in the car together on the way there. And I'd say that we definitely had some mixed feelings about the process of listing this home. I think we were, in the back of our minds, we knew that we had a very big disconnect between where we felt the value of the property was and where the seller's value was. So I'd say our attitude going into that meeting, or at least my attitude, was a little bit, there were some mixed feelings there because you don't want to go into that kind of situation. And it's a tough situation for any agent to be in, right? Because on the one hand, you you want to work with that client, and you want to have a good interaction. But then on the other hand, you also want to be honest about where you feel the value lies, because you don't want to give false hope to that seller either. So that was attitude going in. I'd say there were some conflicted feelings on my end.
Yeah, and those were shared. And a lot of our conversation was the fact that this client previously had said, yes, you guys are going to be the agents that are going to take care of us. And so we kind of had that in the back of our minds. I knew they weren't interviewing anybody else. So that's actually another important point, is it's not like they were interviewing other agents, which may make this sound worse or better, but it's not like we lost to another agent. We almost lost, in a sense, to ourselves, but there's some pretty heavy caveats to this. In the sense, there was no other agent on this client's mind. So when we were going over there, we were having this kind of like crisis, I would say, between us, because generally, like our time is limited. Our time just, with everything that goes on in life, with sales, brokerage, rev, there's a lot of competing priorities. So a lot of our thought process comes down to, okay, if we're going to be maintaining a listing for 6 months, a year, 2 years, what is that coming at the cost of? And what is that going to do to us as far as what our process is for listing maintenance? So a lot of folks will know that our listing maintenance process includes this concept of a Market Monday, where on Mondays we send out these updates. But on top of that, there's just a lot of communication as you're going through a listing. And so we were having a little bit of a crisis here, because we were like, we know that there's a disconnect between where we see the value and where the seller sees the value. And then to layer on top of that, which I know we're going to get into, there was a pretty hefty personality mismatch. And we could have seen that. We could have seen that well in advance. And we didn't necessarily capitalize on that a few years ago when we were starting this discussion, in the sense that we noticed it, but we didn't actually action it in any sense. So we were a little bit skeptical going into this presentation. Anyways, we went through the presentation, and then we had a follow-up meeting set for the following week. And so I just called to kind of confirm the follow-up meeting, and they said, bad news. We've decided to look for another agent. I said, okay, yeah, no problem, And part of me was like, kind of the internal thought process. I don't know if you felt this too, Willemina, but my thought process was, okay, we were going into this listing presentation skeptical of if we were even going to take the listing. Like, that's how we were talking in the car. We're like, I don't even know if we should take it, because if it's going to be this high and this far out, the listing maintenance over the course of a year, and if it's a personality that we may not see eye to eye with, it could be a really challenging 6 months or a year. And so when the client called and said that, or when I called the client and they said that they're going to shop for other realtors, part of me thought, thank God, because relief. Part of me was relief, but there's still the sting, is there not? Like, in a sense, we didn't necessarily want the listing because of that, among other things. But there's also a sting. Did you not feel that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I mean, there's still a feeling of rejection regardless, right? I think that's one of the hardest things in this industry, is that it's a personal win or a personal rejection when somebody chooses to either work with you or not. And I mean, there are a lot more things to consider, but it still always is. It's not easy when somebody says, I'm choosing not to work with you.
Totally. Because it's like there's an element, I think, of, it feels kind of personal in real estate. Like when you're with a company and you're a salesperson, let's say, and they say, we're not going with your company, you're like, okay, well, you're not going with my company. But when they say, like, we're not going with you, we're going to go find another person, there is something personal to that. And I think that we should all understand that it's going to sting for a period of time. And I think we've said this before, that as you progress in the career, I find that the sting still happens. It's just not as pronounced and doesn't last as long.
You grow a thick skin in this industry over time. You really do. You have to just build up a bit of a shield around you to be able to deal with rejection.
Exactly. Yeah.
Even though it's funny, because in this case it's almost like we wanted, in a way, this outcome. Like, there was part of us that wanted to not take this listing. It's very different than losing when you really want the listing. Totally. Like, I think it's a blessing in disguise, but yeah, it's still that.
Question for you as you're bringing that up. Do you think that came across in how we were presenting? Do you think the fact that part of us didn't want the listing, did that come across?
It's hard to say, but we like to always think that our internal feelings, at least I think that when you go into a presentation with a client, you try to, sometimes you have to cover what you're really thinking. That's one of the big things in real estate. But maybe there probably is an element to that where, potentially. On the other hand, I also think in this case, it maybe that's putting the blame and saying, okay, maybe we weren't as excited. But I think it came down to the seller wanting an agent who believed the price he wanted was justified. I think at the bottom of it all, because I think he kind of, in a way, threw us the meeting was almost to see my thoughts on the price too, because I think he knew your price and he wanted to see whether I was in agreement with that. I remember that question coming up of saying, well, what do you think? And I think they wanted at least one of us to think that their price was justified. But that's a very slippery slope, because think about it this way. It's like, okay, so let's say, for instance, that we would have played along and said, okay, we think, yeah, absolutely. Like, I think that you can get that price. You're, as an agent, when you go against your own better judgment, you are setting yourself up for failure, because if the market's not going to pay that price, but you've told that agent that you believe it's justified, who are they going to blame when that doesn't happen, right? They're going to say, well, you said this was doable. You believed in this price too. So the issue must be you as an agent, or it must be your marketing, or it must be the photos, or, it must be something. They pick something that doesn't actually, it's not relevant. But so it's kind of a lose-lose situation when there's this huge disconnect, because in this case, and I think that's why we dodged a bullet here, because it's not a good situation for a seller to go into a listing with an agent who doesn't believe in their price. Mm-hmm. I would agree with that. But there's there's just no good way forward when there's this big of a disconnect. There truly isn't, because the outcome isn't going to be smooth. And even though the seller may start off by saying, oh, we don't care how long it takes, because that's often what sellers, when they know they're pricing high, they kind of internally know, they say, we're not in a rush.
Yeah, well, that was said. Let's be clear. Said,
yeah.
Because we asked the question, what happens if it doesn't sell? Oh, we'll take it off and we'll try again next year, was the response, right?
Well, actually, yeah, exactly. And so I think it was also made clear that the price that we thought it was worth was not an option. And I think that's another key consideration for an agent when you're having that discussion with the seller and there is that disconnect is okay, so let's see, like let's say that we list it at this price, and let's say we go 6 months without an offer. What's next? Like, what's your next step? Like, are you willing to come down to that number eventually, or are we, is it a non-starter to reduce the price to where we think it should be? And I think that it's very hard to get to the bottom of that and get an honest answer, I think, but that is a very telling thing.
And I think sometimes the seller doesn't know. I think sometimes the seller doesn't, depending on their motivation levels, they could be willing to reduce more or less than we think, really.
Yeah.
And kind of the other piece to this, which I think is important to mention, and then let's jump into some of the conversations that were had and how we thought through pricing and things like that. But I think another really important point to bring up here, which we've kind of touched on, is the fact that there was a personality mismatch. And what do I mean by that? Well, there's certain personalities that we all really are just going to jive with more than others. There's certain personalities that I work with really well. There's certain personalities that you work with really well. And oftentimes those are different personalities. This personality is a personality type that I would say is probably the most challenging for myself and probably for you as well. So there was a mismatch there. Now, what does that actually mean? Let's actually put that into context, what exactly that looks like. Very, very strong driver personality. Now, generally speaking, there's not really anything wrong with being a strong driver and wanting things your way. But in this case, as we started to kind of do some digging and understanding and listening, there was we saw some rude stuff that was posted online, right? There was some rude stuff on a Twitter feed that was publicly, I guess, put out there. There was also some comments that were made that were pretty aggressive towards other people, like very, very condescending and very negative towards other very respected people, such as, bankers, lenders, appraisers, all sorts of things like that. There was always a lot of almost hatred, I would say. That's almost the feeling that I got. is when we were bringing up other parties that were part of this, there was almost hatred towards how if somebody didn't see the world his way, whether that be politically, which is kind of what we were talking about there on the Twitter side, or whether it be with his house, if you don't believe in what his direction is, then you're nothing to him. Like, you're absolutely nothing. And I think was the most important point for me, was not the fact that he was high on price, because almost every seller is going to be high on price. This was a pretty major disconnect, but it was also the fact that anyone who doesn't believe in his way of thinking is wrong and kind of dead to him.
Yeah. It was kind of that feeling, that gut feeling, I think, that we both had. And I think that's where the unease came from going to this presentation. But knowing that no matter what the market was going to say to us, because we always tell sellers, the market will speak to us, right? We don't say it's our opinion. It's not our opinion on price. It's the market that responds. And this was a kind of situation where when I thought about what would happen is even if the market spoke and the response was, we're not getting showings, right? And nobody's putting in any offers, I'm not certain that would have changed his belief in the value of his home. Like, I don't think that the facts would have followed, or that he would have changed his opinion based on the facts of what the market response is. And that to me is a very important distinction to make, because there are some people who, we talked about this, where it's like, maybe it's just the personality, they may be out to lunch on price, there may be a disconnect, but there's a personality that they're open to adjustment, right? Or they're open to correcting that. If and you can get a feeling for that, are they open to hearing what you have to say, and are they, or is it will nothing change their mind? And I think that makes a big difference as to whether or not you should consider taking a listing that is priced higher than.
Yeah. So you said this off the air. Willemina said this. She said, one of the hardest things about this situation is we have, a seller who is like extremely resolute about everything that's kind of said and done, that this is the way it goes based on his perspective. And that perspective is, 20% too high from a market value. So you have two forces here. It's one thing if the seller thinks the home is worth more than it actually is. We deal with that all the time. And that personality is also one that's open to understanding how the market's functioning. And then there's also the people that are like really hard drivers, that this is the way the world works, but they're also open to listening to the fact of this is how the market is working. And then you have this, where you have somebody who's not going to look at the market and not look at what's going on, complete blinders, and then also be in this position of extreme driver, and it's either my way or the highway. And as soon as you have that, I think that's a listing that most of us need to be very willing to walk away from very quickly.
Yeah. Because no matter how you cut or slice it, the outcome is not going to be positive, right? There's not going to be, there's no good outcome here, because every path is going to end up with the blame lying, because this is the type of situation where it's not going to be, we should have priced it lower from the get-go. It's like, no, now we have a listing that's been in the market for 365 days plus that nobody's looking at because everybody's assuming there's something wrong with it. Even if it, or maybe you're getting some showings, but either way, you're reducing price and you're going to get a low offer eventually, potentially, but there's no good outcome, because usually what happens, and we've gone through this before, and if a listing sits for a long time, off the start, a seller thinks, I'm fine with it taking a long time, not a problem, right? But I think there's something that sellers miss in that, is that having your home in the market is not, especially in a homeowner, in an owner-occupied property, is not a fun process. You have to keep things show ready. You do have showings coming through. You have to vacate the home. If you have pets or kids or anything like that, that even adds more complicated factors to getting out of the home. But it's not a fun process to go through, especially as it drags on. So after a year, that seller is frustrated. They're frustrated because the market proved them wrong, and they don't want to admit that, right? They don't want to admit that. So they are going to put the blame on the agent, and they're going to say that maybe after a year, they are willing to reduce the price by a little or a lot. But they're going to say, you know what? Let's try a different agent. Yeah, at that point, because we've been that agent who's come in as the second agent. We've had that
both sides in the past. So we've been the second. We've also been the first. So we've been through both sides of that.
We've been through both sides, and I think many agents have gone through that. But it just, after a certain point in time, I think regardless, if the seller's not getting the outcome they want, even though we may have told them from the get-go that this was going to happen, they're still going to blame us. They still blame us. It's we're the scapegoat. And this is something that, being a realtor in general, every deal, everything is our fault and our problem, even if it truly isn't or shouldn't be. It still comes down to us, right? It's we're the ones keeping this deal together, and everything gets blamed on us if it doesn't go well, right? So even if the problem was pricing, they're going to say, well, maybe let's try somebody new.
Exactly. And so in this case, and usually, when we're talking about overpricing listings, like there is a potential that the home still sells over our value, right? For all of us, whenever we value a home, we can't say with 100% certainty it's going to sell for at or below our number, or even around our number. We can't say that with 100% certainty, but we can look at the market in order to determine generally what our thoughts are. But what are we looking for ultimately? Like if we're going to price something 25% or 20% over where we see the market value, who's going to pay that price? It has to be somebody who is basically what we call a needle in the haystack buyer. And oftentimes we'll bring that up, that we're looking for the needle in the haystack buyer then ultimately. And one conversation I'll typically have with sellers is, as soon as you start to look for the needle in the haystack buyer, your buyer pool shrinks. Like most people can understand that, right? If we're looking for just this single one buyer, our buyer pool is going to be a lot smaller than if we're marketing to a general audience. So that being said, when we have a smaller buyer pool, that also will impact generally the value of the property. So take, for example, you have a home right now that you're going to list and it has a tenant in it, and the tenant is in there for another year. So your buyer pool now becomes investors only and not owner occupied. So how do you value that? Well, it's very hard to value that the same as every other property that's vacant on the market, because that also can apply to owner occupants. So you have to almost think of this as a decrease. It's actually like a negative. And if you're looking for the needle in the haystack buyer, it is mostly going to be a drawback. Your buyer pool is going to shrink, and therefore your chances of selling plus your value will likely be lower. And I think that was hard to communicate to him. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's that. I think this is what sellers make this assumption that a buyer is just going to fall in love with their place and be willing to pay whatever price. Yeah. That's kind of that's what they're ideally, that's what they have in their mind. They think somebody's going to come along and maybe it's based in the fact, okay, they've lived in the home for a long time. They love it. They've put effort into it. I get that. I really, how much I love our home and how much effort I put into it. And I probably think it's worth more than what the market would be willing to pay, right? But there's that emotional connection that sellers have to their home, and that's understandable. But they assume, okay, somebody's going to also have that feeling when they walk in here, they're going to love this, and therefore they're going to be willing to pay my price. But what that's failing to account for is the fact that, well, usually a buyer doesn't, when a serious buyer who says, okay, I'm going to buy a property, they don't usually start off by just landing on just that specific listing and considering that one in a vacuum. But rather, they usually start with a budget and say, here's my budget. I'm willing to spend $1 million. Now, they're going to say, okay, what's the area you want to be in? Okay, let's figure that out. What are the features I'm looking for? But now you're going to look in that budget, and you're going to, a buyer naturally is going to try to find the best options within their budget. It's human nature. You're looking for the best one. So what are you doing? You're going to look through a bunch of listings. Maybe their agent's sending them some properties, but they're going to evaluate all those listings, but they're not evaluating that one listing in a vacuum. You're evaluating them, comparing them to what else is on the market. That is the process by which a buyer selects what properties they want to even go out and look at. Like maybe you start off, the realtor sends the 10 properties that they think are the best value price ratio on the market, given their criteria. And then the buyer goes through and says, okay, I love this one looks great. This one looks better than that one. This one's now on the top of my list. But you're constantly comparing the options out there. That's the buyer process. You're saying this one's better, this one's less. But you need to be in the top 5 in order to be part of those showings. And if your property, comparative to others on the market, is just, you're not seeing that same value, now you're not even getting showings at all. And that's why your buyer pool is so much smaller when you overprice.
Yeah, that's actually a really important point. Like people are Buyers look within a budget. They don't find the home they love and then try to fit that home into the budget. They instead search for homes within a budget. And so if we're outside of that, then we're going to be in a tough spot. Here's the challenge. How do you know if you're outside of that and you don't have comparables to back it up? One thing actually that Willemina brought up during the presentation, which I think was actually very well received and was a good suggestion, was let's look at all. So let's say that we thought it was worth 7, seller thought it was worth 950. So we're going to pull all the active properties at 950 in your area and around and say, how do we compare? How do we compare? And let's just look at the active properties at that price point, because that's the budget that people is at. What Willemina is saying here, that's the budget that people are searching within. So let's see if we can actually be one of those top 5 and work through that process, which I think was a really good suggestion. That's what we were going to do on our second meeting before we got told we're not proceeding.
Yeah.
So that was one thing, and then the other thing that you said, and that we've brought up on the show before, is this concept that you're not just selling it to a buyer. Even if a buyer falls in love with it, the buyer's agent is going to have a say in this too, right? They're going to indicate that this is overvalued. You should pay X price. And then on top of that, you have another party that you brought up. That was actually, when you said that, I looked over and there was like, their eyes kind of started to get a little wider. What'd you bring up there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is something that sellers don't really think about. But let's say in this scenario, let's say an overpriced listing, and let's say there is a buyer out there who just thinks this home is unique and is by some miracle is willing to pay well over market value. Let's say they're willing to pay 150 grand over market value. Okay. Now, we know that most buyers are getting financing. It's pretty rare to have an all cash buyer, true all cash buyer. So most people are getting financing. Now, when that property goes to the bank's going to do an appraisal. That bank appraiser needs to give a value to the bank that makes sense, and the house is not going to appraise. If it's a property or a price that's been accepted that's well above market value, it likely won't appraise, and the bank's going to say no. And then what's the buyer going to do? The buyer's going to go back to the seller and say, sorry, this is what the bank thinks. I still want to buy it, but now I want to reduce the price. Or they're going to say, sorry, I'm going to back out because this price is not going to work for me. So there's that built-in element of the bank is not going to lend on more than what they believe the property is worth. So you can't really get around that. You can't get around the market value.
No, you ultimately can't get around how the bank's going to look at it. And, this brings up another point, is if you're struggling with pricing a property, even if you have an element of doubt, order an appraisal. And we've done that before. Actually, we did that recently. It was a seller's suggestion, actually, but we still ordered it and got it all done. They wanted an appraisal on the property to make sure that it would appraise. And so ultimately, if we're unsure as agents, now when it comes to appraisers, if you've been in the industry for a while, you probably know like appraisers are going to make mistakes too, because they have access to the exact same data and they do a very similar process to what we do. However, they do a lot more of them. Let's just be honest. They're doing CMAs for a living. We're doing it as a component of our living. So that being said, it's still additional source of data for them. And the reason why I think the eyes lit up there was because there was an appraisal done on this particular property about a year ago or so, and it was I think it was actually lower than what our value was. And so I think that's where the eyes really lit up when you said that, because that's a very, very important factor in this. And that it's a good strategy if you're struggling with pricing a place. Order an appraisal, because even if you're paying for the appraisal, it's what, a few $100, and then you have another source of data. That's not to say the appraisal's right by any means, but it's another piece of data.
Yeah, and sometimes that's what you need multiple sources of data, because for the seller, they in their mind, their only goal or obstacle is finding somebody who falls in love with their home. That's the goal they have. It's like they believe that there's that emotional connection, and I think you said this really well the other day too, is people consider their home an extension of themselves. And so when somebody tells them that that is worth less than what they had built it up to be, you're essentially like crushing a piece of them, like their soul almost. Like it's like they put a lot of, there's a lot of emotion that goes into that valuation for them.
Yeah. So the conversation we were having that Willemina is referencing here is we were talking a little bit about homes and valuations and overpriced listings, because of course this sparked this conversation. We started talking about the fact that, when we think of our home and we think of that home as a number. So all of our sellers, all of our clients, all of our past clients all have a number in their mind of what their home's worth. They all do. And that number, in a sense, is part of a reflection. Like it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. Let me be very clear about this. It absolutely shouldn't be. But they're getting a sense of their self-worth based on what they see the value of their home. A lot of people do this, and we shouldn't do this. If you're one of these people, I mean, we've done this before too, and it's not the right thought process because, of course, it can just lead to stress. But that being said, a lot of people see their home as an extension of themselves. So when we say that their home is worth less than they think it is, it feels like a personal attack, even though it's not from our perspective. There's a secondary component to this, and it's that oftentimes people's retirement is tied up into their primary residence. Very, very often. And if you're helping somebody, then, and let's say that they are expecting to get a certain number and then now an agent comes in and says, you're going to get 200K less. Well, that can have a pretty meaningful impact potentially on your retirement plans, on sending your kids to college, whatever that might be. So not only is it this extension of the home, but it's also like now you're impacting their ability, their wealth as they continue on. Now you're not impacting it. That's the hardest thing. We need to help people understand that it's the market, and we're explaining the market. This is our perspectives on the market. That doesn't mean it still doesn't sting for them. And I think that's where this concept of empathy really needs to play in, which is very hard. It's very hard to be empathetic when we also have somebody kind of almost yelling at us, telling us that our pricing's out to lunch. But that's where I think a lot of this is coming from. And I think if we understand that, it almost helps us understand how we're going to, we can address it too, right? We can address the fact and call it out if need be.
Yeah, that's very well said. I think it's having some empathy too. At the end of the day, it's understand, like trying to put yourself into that seller's shoes. It doesn't mean that you should work together, but it's a delicate subject to have this discussion with the seller where there's a disconnect. It's a very delicate situation.
It is. And we're going to get into some things that we think we did well and things we could have done better. So we'll do that next. But one other point that I just wanted to bring up is, regardless of the price, let's just take the price out of this. If there's a strong personality mismatch, it's a listing that you probably don't want to take, period. Like regardless of if that price is even within the range, like I'm hesitant to still take those listings. We've had situations where things have gone south with these folks. In fact, there was one that was very, very recent that I was getting, well, it was definitely daily. And then it started to move to about hourly text messages on why my home isn't sold. And so there was a number of phone calls. And then at one point in time, I went out for a workout. It was about an hour. And my watch was buzzing with calls. And I knew who it was because I looked at my watch as I was doing my workout, and I knew who it was. And I'm like, well, I'm going to finish my workout here. And then I'll call them right back. And so called her back afterwards, and she didn't answer, but sent me a text message that said, "You're my realtor, and I expect my realtor to respond to me right away when I send a message." And she's like, "You are not allowed to take this long to get back to me." Bear in mind, it was 1 hour.
It was a Sunday too. It was a Sunday afternoon. And in the meantime, while you were doing the workout, she then proceeded to call me multiple times. Yeah. So she called me and I talked to her.
Yeah. So actually she got the response she needed to. But anyways, when that text message came in, we had a lot of back and forth. Willemina and I, not with the client, was separate from this. And we canceled the contract. We sent a note to her saying, "Thank you so much, but at this point in time, we'd like to go our separate ways," and sent a termination.
Yeah.
And we were very relieved and happy when that happened, because these personality mismatch, there's two things. This person I don't want to deal with. And B, if this person refers me somebody, there's also a good chance that person's in a circle that is potentially not my target audience anyways. So like, even if I did get that transaction and by some miracle the home gets sold, if I was to get a referral from that person, that's not to say that the person who's referred in is not going to be a great client, there's a good chance that they could be fantastic. But there's also a pretty good chance that there could be another mismatch, and we're building basically to the wrong audience.
Yeah. And to further that, I think there's often agents get to this point, we get here all the time, when you feel like you've put in so much effort already that you just want to get to the finish line because you've already put in all this time, right? You've spent all this time, effort, money, done all this stuff to get to this point, and then you feel like, we should just power through, just push through and get to the finish line, right? I think that's often a thought that agents have. But if you actually sometimes take a step back and say, where are we at right now, and how, like, just because we've done all this already doesn't mean that we're any closer to the finish line. Like, the finish line is here. We could be going around in circles back here, and we feel like we're getting closer, but we're actually not, because there's this big disconnect between the finish line and where we need to get, and the seller's personality is blocking that. So we have this feeling that we should do that. But in reality, what's happening is that client is taking up a lot of brain space, because they're taking up your time. And even if you can deal with that, it's still in the back of your mind, and it's taking time, it's causing stress, and you're now losing time. You're not able to spend that time on clients that you actually want to work with. So you're actually, by getting rid of this difficult client, you're now freeing up time. And during that time, you can lay groundwork with 3 other good clients who you can probably get 3 deals done with in the time that you'd still be spinning your tires with that difficult seller, because there's a lack of trust from I think that's also it, right? They're not they have their own agenda, and they're not willing to work with you, that you're not working together to get to the outcome you need. And so it's better to just cut ties, be done, move on, and focus on clients where you do have that right fit, where you feel like you're working together towards a common goal with mutual trust, mutual respect, and you're going to enjoy the job more, but you're also going to get a better outcome. And then you're going to end up with clients who are happy at the end of the day, that will refer you to their friends and family. So it's just that 80-20 rule again, right? It's you don't want to focus on those people that bring you down, but focus on working with good people.
But I think this is something that I think we've gotten better with over the years. So I can't say that it's just like a natural thing, but starting to analyze not just time or money. So for example, like, we're going to invest X amount in marketing. We're going to invest a ton of time. So let's say that, we don't have a problem investing that in marketing, and we have the time. Let's say that was the case. There's this other component that none of us seem to take into consideration, and I didn't for years and years, but now I see it actually happening in our conversations, which is brain space. And this is something that, like, we just don't consider. We're like, okay, well, maybe let's say I don't have a ton of clients on the go right now. Let's say I'm a newer agent and I'm dealing with one of these people right now. And I'm like, okay, well, I have the time. And if it's a 6-month listing, great, because maybe I'll get some leads from it or something like that. But what we're not taking into consideration is this concept that you brought up of brain space. And this has been the killer for me. It's not the time. I mean, I'll work until the job is done, no problem. It's not the time as much as it's the mental anguish of getting a buzz on my phone and looking down with an element of fear that it might be this client who has something rude to say about me, about my marketing, about something. And how I wake up and check my text and I see that I have a text from this person. I don't want to open it. That has way bigger impact on me than my listing maintenance time, or even the money for that matter. Because I can remember, you'll know exactly who I'm talking about, but the client that used to text me all day, every day while their listing were listed. We did about 3 or 4 transactions with them. It ended very, very poorly. But from an outsider's perspective, how was I handling that? Pretty bad, I'm guessing. You saw a lot of stress in me whenever that home or their homes were on the market. Then here's the thing: is the economic potential of these other clients that we were talking about. They did about 6 transactions with us, well over our average price for our city. They're kind of 9 to 1.4-ish range, and there was 6 transactions, and eventually had to cut ties with them because of this concept of just extreme amounts of stress that the client is placing on us. Now, we have to be able to handle stress. Absolutely. Actually, the episode that we did last week, if you haven't heard it, definitely tune in, have a listen to that, because we talk a lot about some of the stressful situations in real estate, and this included. But mind space is something that we don't put enough emphasis on, I feel like.
Yeah, I think that's, and I think you're right. I think you've come to realize that over the years. And I'd say, I mean, we've been doing this for a long time now. At the beginning of our careers, I think there's also some confidence that builds internally, where at the beginning of your career, it's sometimes hard to identify these situations. And so that's, I think, where we now can look back when we start working with a client. It's almost like there's a gut feeling where we have that. It's not always consciously. I think a lot of it is subconsciously. There's signs that are given off by the client where there's an internal alarm bells going off, being like, oh, something's not feeling right. And I think we have to honor that and listen to that. And if you're a new agent, that can be tough. And I think it's very challenging as a new agent, because I think as a new agent, often you're dealing with the fact that you're trying to get business. So it can be very hard to close a door, right? But I think what's important to remember is that certain times, like listening to your gut feeling, if it's not going to be the right fit, you need that brain space, that mind space, and your actual time. Like, go find other people that you do jive with, that you do connect with, and that you'll be happier at the end of the day. And I think you also will be more successful. You'll put more money in your pocket in a better way, because you're being more genuine and dealing with good people.
Yeah. You'll like the career way more too, ultimately. So as we kind of wrap up here, I'd love to know what's something you think we did well, and what's something you think we could have done better in this situation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what we did well was, I think we priced the home the best we could given the data available, but I think we did do a good job with that. And I think what we did well was communicate that, because, perhaps when at the beginning of our career, we may not have been confident enough to communicate that to a seller. We would have let the seller dictate that, and we would have doubted our own pricing, and we would have perhaps gone down this road, and we perhaps would have gone through a year-long period of a listing and been in a much worse situation at the end of it, because things didn't go as planned and we would have been fired and that. So I think in this case, what we did well was stick to our pricing and communicate that to the seller. I think that was something we did well.
Yep.
Something that we could have done differently, I think perhaps we could have had the discussion sooner, because I think it's been a couple of years really to get to this point, and perhaps we could have been more resolute about saying, okay, we may not be the right fit for this because we don't think we can meet your expectations on price, and perhaps could have done that sooner. Yeah. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, totally agree on both those. One thing, my thing we did well, I think, is I agree with you. We were honest. We were 100% honest. We never lied. We never tried to indicate that a home was worth more than we thought it was. We stuck to our guns, which we did so in a respectful way. We were communicative, and we outlined the information. We also outlined areas where there were some unknowns. And I think that I felt really good about. This is just, I guess, something we could have done better. I totally agree with you. We knew that this viewpoint on price was out to lunch a number of years ago, and potentially that conversation would have been better had at that point in time, because we wouldn't have then had to have a number of years of meetings and an ongoing discussion to get to this point. So I totally agree with you on that point. The other thing, and this was just one thing they said when they were telling us why, that bugged me, was they said that we want somebody who's really passionate about, or we didn't see the passion in you two when it came to our house, and I felt bad about that. So something I could have done better. I don't ever want a seller to think that I'm not passionate about their listing or their home. I think we were operating from a place of logic, and we were operating from a place of, we went into that meeting saying we need to have them understand the value of their home. We didn't go into that meeting thinking that we had to portray a certain way, but I never want to come across as not passionate about potentially a listing. So that was a good takeaway for me, is, regardless of the circumstances, we have to continue to show a level of passion both in our career and the listing process, but we have to do so with a level of A, confidence, and B, we just can't lie. If this is where we see the value, we have to be honest about that. And that, if that ends up leading to this sort of situation that we're in right now, ultimately we're going to look back on this. I already feel like it's a win. Like the more as time goes on, the more I wake up and I'm like, oh, thank goodness I'm not going to have to take care of that for the next year. So ultimately it feels like a win. Do you feel the same way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think every time, any situation in real estate, you learn something every single time. And there's a lot of takeaways, but I think the more we go along, the more confident we are about what we offer, who we are, and it's just we don't have to work with everybody, and that's okay.
Yeah, I agree. Awesome place to leave it. Thank you so much, Willemina.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And remember, if you have any questions, comments, feel free to reach out anytime at revrealestateschool.com, or I'm on Instagram at the.michael.montgomery. And Willemina's Instagram?
What is it now? Willemina _Montgomery.
Amazing. Thank you, everybody. Bye for now.
Thanks.